Welcome back to the life with the Browns. The catfishing stuff was probably stuff she brought to me. That's Kody Brown in season 20, casually rewriting a decade of televised history like the cameras weren't rolling the entire time. He says it with the calm confidence of a man who assumes no one will go back and rewatch the footage. He frames himself as the informed husband, the steady leader, the concerned partner who knew something was off and tried to help his struggling wife. And if you've only been half paying attention to sister wives over the years, you might even buy it. But here's the problem. There are 20 seasons of receipts. Because what Kody conveniently leaves out of this polished, victim-centered narrative is the 3 to 5 years of emotional erosion that happened long before anyone named Sam Cooper ever slid into Meri Brown's inbox. Long before the scandal. Long before the voicemails. Long before the headlines. The truth is, the marriage was already collapsing in slow motion, and it wasn't because of a catfish. It was because of neglect. Years before 2015, Kody himself admitted on camera that his intimate relationship with Meri had been dead. Not struggling. Not complicated.
Dead.
His words. The physical connection?
Gone.
The emotional closeness? Withered. The affection? Withheld. Meri wasn't living as a cherished wife. She was living as a legal technicality. In Las Vegas, she had a house, a ring, and a title, but no partnership.
No pursuit. No worms.
Just distance. Just silence. Just that painful, awkward dynamic of two people who used to love each other but now barely know how to speak without tension. And while Meri was shrinking into isolation, Kody was expanding elsewhere. New energy. New excitement. New focus. A new wife who was getting the time, attention, and emotional investment Meri hadn't seen in years. That context matters. Because catfishing doesn't happen in a vacuum. People don't wake up in secure, thriving marriages and decide to emotionally attach themselves to strangers online. That's not how vulnerability works. That's not how loneliness works. Loneliness is cumulative. It builds quietly, brick by brick. Conversation by conversation that never happens. Touch by touch that never comes. Meri didn't almost leave Kody for a catfish the way the public narrative likes to frame it. She reached for validation in a moment when her marriage had already been reduced to paperwork and polite indifference. When the scandal broke, Kody performed shock. Betrayal. Hurt pride. But betrayed from what? From a marriage he had already publicly declared broken? From a relationship he admitted he had no romantic interest in repairing? From a wife he had emotionally sidelined while building a full, functioning partnership with someone else? That's where the revisionist history starts to wobble. Because if the intimacy was gone for years, if the emotional bond had already dissolved, if Meri was functionally alone inside her own marriage, then the narrative of wronged husband doesn't hold the same weight. What actually happened was far more complicated and far less convenient. Meri was isolated, humiliated, struggling with an empty nest, trying to figure out who she was in a plural family dynamic that had clearly shifted. And instead of being pulled closer during that vulnerable season, she was kept at arm's length. The cameras documented it, the tension, the cold conversations. The awkward therapy sessions where Kody openly admitted he wasn't interested in restoring romance. So when Kody now says, "She brought it to me," as if he was the steady rock guiding her through a sudden lapse in judgment, it ignores years of emotional abandonment that set the stage for that mistake. You can't erase the buildup and only highlight the explosion. The public saw a scandal, but the private reality, the one preserved in episode after episode, shows a woman who was already grieving a marriage long before the internet entered the picture. And here's the part that truly unravels Kody's new version of events. He didn't fight for Meri before the catfish. He didn't pursue her after the catfish. And for years following the scandal, he continued to state plainly that he did not see a future of intimacy with her. So, what exactly is the betrayal narrative protecting? Reputation?
Ego.
Control of the storyline? Because the only way the "I was blindsided" script works is if everyone agrees to forget everything that came before it. But the footage exists. The admissions exist. The distance existed. The catfishing wasn't the beginning of the end. It was a symptom. And once you look at it that way, the story stops being about a wife who strayed and starts being about a marriage that had already been quietly abandoned long before anyone ever typed the name Sam Cooper. In season 20, Kody says something that should have stopped the entire conversation in its tracks. If we'd had a good relationship, this would have been resolvable. Read that again. If they'd had a good relationship. That's not a defensive husband talking. That's a man admitting on camera that the marriage was already fractured, already unhealthy, already missing something essential. And yet somehow, in Kody's version of events, that admission doesn't circle back to him. The relationship was bad. The marriage was broken. But none of that was his responsibility. He manages to hold two completely opposing ideas at the same time. The marriage was unhealthy, and the catfishing was unforgivable. The marriage was unhealthy, but he played no role in why. That contradiction is the crack in the entire narrative. Because Meri didn't reach for a stranger online out of boredom. She reached because she was starving. Starving for affirmation. For pursuit. For someone to choose her, not tolerate her. Yes, she made a terrible choice. No one disputes that. But the hunger behind that choice didn't come from nowhere. It was cultivated. Years of distance. Years of emotional coldness. Years of watching her husband invest romance and energy elsewhere while telling her, plainly, that he didn't see a future of intimacy. Kody helped build the emptiness, and then acted stunned when she tried to fill it. But now we need to step into the part of the story that has always felt unfinished. The part the show never fully examines. The Robin, Kendra, Jackie connection. Because there's an elephant in every single catfishing discussion, and everyone keeps politely stepping around it. Jackie Overton was the catfisher. She pretended to be Sam Cooper, the wealthy businessman who emotionally entangled Meri. Jackie was friends with a woman named Kendra. And Kendra was close friends with Meri Brown. Let that sit for a second. The person who manipulated Meri had a connection, however indirect, to Kody's fourth wife. And somehow, over the span of 20 seasons, that connection has never been seriously unpacked. Every time it surfaces, the topic shifts. How did Robin know about the flowers Meri received? How did she know about the tone of the texts? How did she know intimate details of conversations that were supposedly private? Robin's explanation has always been simple. She was helping. She was concerned. She had Meri's back. But Meri has said something that complicates that narrative. She told Robin to stop communicating with Kendra about the situation. Directly. She asked her to stop sharing information with someone connected to the chaos. And, according to Meri, Robin didn't stop. The communication channel remained open. Information continued to move. And here's where it becomes deeply unsettling. Meri has stated that private conversations she had exclusively with Robin somehow made their way back to the catfisher. Conversations that, in theory, had no other audience. That's not a small detail. That's not a harmless misunderstanding. That's either an extraordinary coincidence or a serious breach of trust. Now, to be fair, there could be an innocent explanation. It's possible Robin believed she was helping. It's possible she underestimated the damage. It's possible the connection was indirect and messy and poorly handled. But what makes this troubling isn't just the connection. It's the silence around it. Kody has never publicly pressed the obvious questions. He has never shown curiosity about how information traveled. He has never expressed visible concern that someone in his wife's orbit was connected to the person exploiting her. Instead, his energy has consistently gone toward defending Robin and reinforcing the narrative that Meri alone detonated the marriage. And that selective scrutiny is telling. Because if you're truly trying to understand how your wife was manipulated, wouldn't you want to examine every possible pathway? Wouldn't you ask how the catfisher knew what they knew? Wouldn't you question how private emotional details leaked into the hands of someone weaponizing them? Unless asking those questions threatens the stability of your preferred storyline. This is the part of the saga that never gets the dramatic music. It never gets a reunion special deep dive. It never gets the follow-up interrogation it deserves. Instead, it gets glossed over, redirected, minimized, and Meri is left carrying the full moral weight of the scandal, while the surrounding dynamics remain blurry and conveniently unexplored. The catfishing narrative works best when it's simple: lonely wife, online affair, betrayed husband. But the real story is layered. A broken marriage, emotional neglect, a vulnerable woman, a suspicious web of connections, and a husband who seems far more invested in preserving one relationship than fully examining how another one unraveled. When you step back and look at the entire picture, the question isn't just, why did Meri do it? It's also, who knew what? When did they know it? And why were certain questions never allowed to linger on camera? Because sometimes what's most revealing in a story isn't what gets said. It's what everyone works so hard not to examine. Information she shared with no one else. Details that only existed between her and her sister wife, and then somehow Jackie Overton would know about them. That's not internet speculation. That's Meri. There were times I would have a conversation with Robin that the catfisher would find out about. That's a direct quote. She's not guessing. She's not theorizing. She's describing a pattern she experienced in real time. And the math isn't complicated. If Meri told only Robin something private, something vulnerable, and then the catfisher referenced that exact detail later, there are only a few possible explanations. Either information was being shared, or information was being passed along indirectly, or there's another explanation that, to this day, no one has offered. But what we do know is this: the pipeline existed. Meri speaks. Robin hears. Somehow, Jackie knows. That's not random. When confronted with this dynamic, Robin's defense has always centered on intent. I know what my intentions were. And maybe she did believe she was helping. Maybe she thought staying in contact with Kendra meant she could monitor the situation. Maybe she believed inserting herself into the middle of a crisis she was explicitly asked to step back from was the responsible thing to do. But intentions don't erase outcomes. Good intentions don't explain how private information traveled. Because here's the key detail that never gets resolved. Meri asked her to stop. She didn't hint. She didn't imply. She asked directly. Stop talking. Stop communicating with people connected to this situation. Stop sharing. Stop inserting yourself. And according to Meri, those requests were ignored. That's where this story shifts from misunderstanding to pattern. Because this wasn't just about the catfishing. Every time Robin involved herself in Meri's personal struggles, the situation didn't calm down. It escalated. Private concerns became group discussions. Quiet issues became dramatic confrontations. Information that should have been protected somehow became ammunition. And there's another layer here that deserves attention. The way Robin relayed information to Kody. When she brought concerns about Meri to him, it was rarely framed in a way that softened his heart. It wasn't positioned as, she's hurting. She's lonely. She needs us. It often landed as, look what she's doing. Look how this affects you. Look how this threatens the family. That framing matters. Because if you consistently present someone's vulnerability as betrayal, you shape how they're perceived. You don't create compassion. You create resentment. Maybe Robin didn't realize that. Maybe she truly believed she was protecting the family. But after a certain point, the effect outweighs the intention. If every attempt to help results in more damage, if every involvement intensifies the crisis, if the person you're helping repeatedly asks you to step back and you refuse, what do you call that? Control? Interference? A savior complex? Meri has never labeled it directly on camera. But watch her face in those later seasons. The benefit of the doubt fades. There's exhaustion there. Disbelief. A quiet realization that the narrative being told about her, the reckless wife, the emotional liability, doesn't match the reality she lived. And through all of this, where was Kody? That's the question that lingers. Because if your wife tells you her private conversations are somehow reaching the person manipulating her, wouldn't that alarm you? Wouldn't you investigate? Wouldn't you protect? Wouldn't you at least ask how that's happening? Instead, what we see is unwavering defense. No public curiosity about the information trail. No visible concern about the connection between Kendra and Jackie. No hard questions about how details traveled. Just loyalty to Robin's version. Just reinforcement of the idea that Meri alone detonated everything. And silence can be louder than outrage. Kody had endless energy to dissect Meri's mistakes, endless vocabulary for her betrayal, endless analysis of her emotional weakness. But when it came to examining whether someone in his inner circle might have contributed, even unintentionally, to the chaos, nothing. No deep dive.
No confrontation. No accountability.
That silence tells its own story. Because protecting one relationship often means sacrificing another. And in this case, it feels like Meri wasn't just fighting a catfisher. She was fighting isolation inside her own marriage. She was fighting a narrative that had already been written. And she was fighting to be heard in a family structure where her voice kept getting filtered through someone else. So, when people reduce the catfishing scandal to a simple moral failure, they miss the larger pattern. The broken marriage, the ignored requests, the information trail, the selective scrutiny, the silence where questions should have been. And the most unsettling part? We still don't have clear answers. Only footage, only quotes, only patterns. And sometimes patterns say more than any confession ever could. When his wife was being manipulated by a stranger, humiliated publicly, watching her private voicemails and messages splashed across the internet. Where was the husband who now claims he had her back? Not there. That's the simplest and most uncomfortable answer. He wasn't there. Meri has spoken about asking for space during the height of the catfishing fallout. She needed room to breathe, to process how she had been deceived, to sit with the humiliation, to understand how someone had infiltrated her loneliness and turned it into a public spectacle. And Kody has reframed that request as rejection. She kicked me out. She pushed me away. She chose someone else. But let's put the timeline back in order. Kody hadn't been emotionally present in that marriage for years before the catfishing ever happened. The distance didn't begin with Meri asking for space. The distance was already there, established, normalized routine. Her request wasn't a dramatic shift. It was a continuation of a pattern he had already set. You can't abandon someone slowly for years and then act shocked when they ask for room during a crisis. He frames being kicked out as the ultimate betrayal. The proof that she didn't want the marriage. The evidence that she chose someone else over him. But what he leaves out are the years he chose elsewhere first. The intimacy he admitted was gone. The affection he withheld. The attention redirected. The emotional energy invested in newer relationships while Meri was left navigating an empty house in Vegas. There's footage that tells the real story. Meri alone. Meri trying to connect. Meri attempting conversations that go nowhere. Meri isolated inside a plural family she helped build. And Kody? Somewhere else. With someone else. Always explaining why he couldn't show up consistently for his first wife. The catfishing crisis could have been a turning point. It could have been the moment he stepped forward and said, "Regardless of what happened, I'm here. We'll face this together." Instead, it became justification. Proof she deserved distance. Proof she wasn't loyal. Proof reconciliation was impossible. By season 20, you can actually watch the rewrite happening in real time during his confessionals. Don't put that on Robin. That's totally hypocritical. Notice the reflex. The interviewer mentions the catfishing, and before any accusation is made, Kody jumps to defend Robin. Preemptively. Instinctively. He knows exactly who he needs to protect, and it isn't Meri. That moment reveals everything about priority. Before the question is fully formed, he's already guarding his fourth wife from blame that hasn't even been assigned. And then he labels Meri a hypocrite. But for what? Hypocrisy means claiming one moral standard while secretly violating it. What did Meri publicly preach that her actions contradicted? When did she stand on a pedestal of perfection? She was lonely. She made a reckless emotional decision. That's not hypocrisy. That's vulnerability mixed with poor judgment. Words like betrayal and hypocritical become shields in Kody's vocabulary. They redirect scrutiny. They keep the spotlight fixed on her mistake instead of the environment that made it possible. If Meri is the villain, no one asks about the marriage. If he is the betrayed husband, no one examines his absence. If he shouts hypocrite loudly enough, maybe no one notices he's rewriting the timeline. And by season 20, He doesn't seem like he's performing outrage anymore. He believes his version. The selective memory isn't tactical, it's structural. He's built an identity around being the reasonable one, the wounded one, the man blindsided by his wife's choices. Acknowledging his own role would require dismantling that identity entirely. And so his logic forms a perfect circle, one that never includes him. He argues that the catfishing proves the marriage was broken, that Meri's vulnerability shows something was fundamentally wrong between them.
He's right about that.
The marriage was broken. The catfishing was a symptom. But then he also argues that the catfishing is what broke the marriage, that her actions destroyed any possibility of repair. Both cannot be true at the same time. Either the marriage was already fractured beyond recognition, and the catfishing emerged from that fracture, or the marriage was salvageable until her actions shattered it. He refuses to choose, because either choice requires accountability. If the marriage was already broken, then we have to ask who contributed to breaking it. If he withdrew, if he withheld affection, if he redirected emotional investment, if he slowly detached while expecting loyalty in return, then he shares responsibility for the loneliness that made Meri vulnerable. And that's the part the revised narrative can't accommodate. Because once you admit the conditions mattered, once you admit neglect played a role, once you admit the hunger was cultivated over time, then the story stops being about one woman's failure and starts being about a marriage that was quietly abandoned long before the scandal ever gave it a headline. Here's the crossroads Kody refuses to stand at. If the catfishing destroyed an otherwise healthy marriage, then how did he not notice his wife slipping into an emotional relationship with a stranger online? How was he so absent that someone with a fake name and stock photos could fill a void he didn't even acknowledge? Because you can't claim the marriage was strong and simultaneously admit you had no idea your wife was unraveling in it. This season, we watched what many have called Kody's apology tour. He said he could have been kinder. He admitted he made mistakes. He offered something that looked like regret, as long as you didn't examine it too closely. But there was one apology he never gave. He never said, "I neglected you for years. I withdrew from you. I helped create the loneliness that made you vulnerable." He never connected his behavior to her hunger for connection. He never acknowledged that the catfishing didn't happen to him. It happened to a woman who had already been emotionally sidelined. That's the missing apology. And it's the only one that would actually mean anything, because offering it would dismantle the entire victim narrative he's constructed. It would mean admitting he wasn't an innocent bystander watching a happy marriage implode. It would mean admitting he had already stepped away long before Sam Cooper ever appeared. Let's return to where we started. Season 20. Kody casually claiming the catfishing details were probably things Meri brought to him, positioning himself as informed, present, protective. But look at everything that version leaves out. A marriage he admitted was emotionally dead years before 2015. A fourth wife whose close friend had ties to the catfisher. A pipeline of private information that somehow flowed from Meri's conversations into her manipulator's hands. A husband who wasn't consistently present during the crisis and later reframed that absence as proof of betrayal. A circular logic that assigns Meri full blame while absorbing none himself. The full picture looks nothing like the retelling. It looks like a husband who withheld love. A first wife growing increasingly isolated inside her own family. A fourth wife whose social orbit overlapped uncomfortably with the person exploiting that isolation. Information traveling in suspicious directions. Questions never fully examined. And now, a man claiming he had her back when the footage suggests he was barely in the room. What Kody forgets isn't random. The gaps in his memory align perfectly with the moments that would require accountability. He remembers the betrayal vividly. He remembers being asked to leave. He remembers the humiliation. But the years of emotional distance?
Gone.
The slow withdrawal of affection?
Erased.
The conditions that made Meri susceptible to someone who simply paid attention to her? Not part of the story. Because his victim status depends on selective recall. If he remembered everything, he'd have to admit something uncomfortable. The catfishing wasn't the disease. It was the symptom. A symptom of a marriage that had already been abandoned in practice, even if it still existed on paper. And here's the part that makes this story so painfully human. Meri didn't fall for a catfish because she was reckless or malicious. She fell because someone pretended to want her. After years of being overlooked, a stranger with a fake persona showed more curiosity about her thoughts, her feelings, her day-to-day life than the man she married at 19. That's devastating. And when that stranger turned out to be a fraud, Kody used it as confirmation that she was the flaw in the system. He forgot his role.
He rewrote the timeline.
He positioned himself as the wounded party and her as the architect of destruction. And maybe he believes it now. Maybe the story has been repeated so often it feels true to him.
But the footage exists.
The admissions exist. The patterns exist. You can't erase years of neglect and replace them with a single moment of scandal. You can't build a narrative on half the timeline and call it complete. And you can't expect everyone watching to forget what they've already seen. We are not forgetting.